All right, guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about how many marches should you run. So we'll actually talk about the early game, mid game, late game, some of the logic behind why or how you're picking what you're picking, and let's get into it. Okay, so the short answer, right, is that you want to actually run as many as your spend, activity, and efficiency of activity can support and sustain. And we'll actually get a little bit more in depth, but that's a general idea. You want as many as possible, provided that you can actually sustain it. Okay, so the first idea, first principle I want to talk about is idea of commander generations, right? So maybe like 2 years ago, there was a thought process that maybe you want to specialize in one troop type, right? So you have 3 or 5, even 5 like infantry marches. The reason why was because if you had like a city skin for infantry health and you lose archer attack, if you have 5 infantry, then the city skin is benefiting all 5 marches. You could pick a civilization type that also benefits that troop type, and you can actually specialize, right? Now, as these commander generations started coming out, so for example, like Nevsky, Scipio, and Boudica Prime were all from the same generation, right? And as the next generation comes out, the gap between generations started becoming like too noticeable. So if you're trying to run 5 infantry marches, you have to use infantry from many, many generations ago, and you're supposed to compete with commanders from, say, like cavalry, archers that are much more recent in the generation. There's just the power creep level is way too big. Also, when Lilith released the armament system, if you get armaments and you're only using infantry, and let's just say you have really good archer or cav stats on the armament, but you can't use it, you're actually losing out on a lot of efficiency, right? So because of those things, the most flexible way to actually run multiple marches now is to at least have 1 of each troop type. And if you're expanding out, you start getting to maybe 2 of each troop type, and maybe even like a 3rd if you're running a 7th march. Okay, so on the screen here is like a representation. So you can imagine if the power level of the first march of every troop type is going to be a 10, right? So right now for infantry, let's just say it's Scipio Luce, Nevsky Joan, and then Herman and ZL. For the most part, maybe there's some exceptions here or there, the second march of a troop type is going to be worse than the first march of a troop type, right? So if you had to split infantry into 2 right now, it would be Gorgo Luce probably as number 1, and then Guan Scipio as number 2. And even though it's close, you probably will take Nevsky Joan over Guan Scipio. And the cavalry troop type is actually due for another release soon, right? So once the new cavalry come out, then that difference will be a lot more noticeable. Or if you take, say, like the 2nd cavalry, right now it's Hull and William, would you rather have Hull and William or Gorgo Luce, right? Or if you just have 1, that's Scipio Luce, like clearly that's just better than the 2nd troop type. So the whole idea is you actually want to be able to spread out and have the top of each troop type at a minimum, because that's where the maximum efficiency is, right? And as you get beyond that, you lose some efficiency, but as I'll show, you can make up for the lack of efficiency with more numbers. So if you can sustain it, you actually want more numbers, right? And by the time you get to the 3rd march of each troop type, so the 3rd for infantry right now will probably be like Sargon and I don't even know, Sargon and someone, Alex, I'm not sure. 3rd for cavalry right now will probably be XY and Justinian, and 3rd for archer would probably be like Henry with, I don't know, YSG or Nebu, right? You can see there's a big drop off. Now, another thing to consider is the marches, it's almost like a base stat, right? So if you have infantry 1, and that's a 10 out of 10, right? You have Scipio Luce. The 2nd cavalry would say be Huo and William, and the 3rd archer would be Henry and let's just say Nebu or YSG, right? If the equipment are all 10 out of 10 and the armaments are all 10 out of 10, they're actually multiplying the base march. So if the base march isn't as good, even if your equipment and armament's really good, it doesn't even scale up as much because you're scaling up off of something that wasn't as good to begin with. So that's why it's kind of like a base stat, because that's how base stats work in this game. So for efficiency's sake, you always want to actually at least get 1 of each true type, the top of each true type first, and then from there, if you want to expand out, you can. Okay, hopefully I made the point for that. Now, there is also something to be said about numbers, right? So on the left here, you can see, pretend someone is doing 6 marches, and we're just to simplify, right? They spent the equivalent of 100 resource points into equipment, 100 resource points into armaments, and they're doing that for all 6 marches. Okay, if you actually bring it down to 3 marches, instead of spending 100 and 100, you could actually consolidate that into 200. So the equipment is going to be a lot better. The armament theoretically should be a lot better, and it's going to be like that for each troop type, right? So if you gave me these versus this, on the right versus the left, right? These 3 marches are just going to be better than the top 3 marches on this side. But when you add in the second march, even though maybe the equipment, the armament isn't nice good, you could actually overwhelm the right side with numbers. And that's where the idea of you want to get as many marches as you can, even though it might be a little less efficient, comes in. Okay, now there is the reason why I said you want as many marches as your spend, activity, and efficiency could support is let's just pretend you have a limited amount of resources, and when you're running, all of a sudden halfway through you can't run 6 marches anymore and you have to drop down to 3. Okay, so now you're taking out the infantry 2, cavalry 2, and archer 2. So if you drop down to 3, which one would you rather have? Would you rather have the thing on the 3 marches on the right here with better equipment and armament, or the 3 marches on the left here, even though it's still Inf1, Cav1, and Archer 1, but the equipment and armaments are actually a little bit worse. So you can see how it's actually a balancing act, right? If your pacing can support more, you want more. But if it's something where your equipment, not your equipment, your resources actually becomes a bottleneck or a limiting factor, then you actually have to go with the marches that you can sustain over time. So that's why like having more farms and buying resources, however you get more resources, is very important, because if your spend is not there, or your activity level, where your chaining barbs isn't there, it's actually going to be better for you to have less marches, because they're going to be more efficient. Ideally, you would like to have the numbers, but if you can't sustain the numbers, and these are actually kind of a waste, right? Infantry 2, cavalry 2, and archer 2, because you won't even be able to use them all the time, and it's actually going to take away from the top end efficiency of your first 3 marches. So I made a guide, and I'll link both videos on the end screen and in the description, but let's actually go back a little bit, right? So once you get to a certain level of equipment, the efficiency of the materials you invest in the equivalent of the equipment also goes down, right? So this is the minimum threshold that you should shoot for before you move on to the next equipment set. And the reason why, the TLDR is that to upgrade from here, even though some is blue, some is purple, you don't get as big of an upgrade, right? So for example, the Hope Cloak gives you, I think, 12% defense, but you're upgrading over a purple chest that is attack. So not only are you stat swapping from attack to defense, but you're also getting a lot more stats. Whereas if you try to, say, upgrade this Kuang's Humility, which gives you health, the purple pants that most people go for is the Eternal Night. You're actually switching from health to defense, which you don't want. But also, I've actually proved in another video, statistically, the Kuang's Humility special talented, so a purple, will actually perform better than the Eternal Night, even if you put an iconic crystal in there. It's not only until you get to probably the Awakened 2 or the second tier of Awakening the Eternal Night where it's probably better than the Kuang's Humility, right? So it's just not worth it. So this is the minimum. It doesn't mean you can't make it any better, but once you get here, if you're looking to expand out on marches to get the numbers, like I talked about earlier, to get 3 marches, this should be the minimum equipment you're shooting for. You can see there's only 2 legendary for the infantry. You really only need the legendary boots for the calves, and then you only need the legendary chest for the archers. And even if you're in, say, like KVK 2, this should still be what you're shooting for, just because when you're earlier in the game, like KVK 2, KVK 1, not KVK 1, KVK 2, and KVK 3, you have to deal with a lot of migrants. So a lot of them already have a huge head start on you time-wise. So if you get here, you can even be competitive with those people that migrated back. Okay, minimum armament goals. This isn't as clear cut. So if you look at the way I call the equipment, right? The equipment, I called it a minimum threshold. Like that's almost like a bare minimum. You have to hit that. The armaments, once you hit the equipment, even if you didn't hit these numbers, you could still run it just because a lot of people haven't worked on it. The reason why they have two sets of numbers here is before February 2026, on February 26, 2024, there are certain armament rules, right? You can only re-roll something 10 times and that's it. You run out of chances to re-roll. Also, in the travel or the dispatch for the troops, there's a lot of junk that's not armaments, whereas they're going to remove a lot of that. So people are going to be able to get a lot more armaments and recycle and get a lot more transmutation stones. And on the right, because I haven't seen what it looks like yet, my guess though is that because players in general are going to be able to get a lot more armaments to recycle and get transmutation stones, where they could re-roll a lot more often, the bottom end of that requirement is probably going to go up, right? So if you look at base stats, attack, defense, and health, if you get all damage, just for simplicity's sake, count it as 2. So if you have 1% all damage, count it as 2. Before, I would say probably the minimum is about 20% that you want to shoot for. After, it's going to go up 4%, 24%. Again, this is just me speculating. I don't know. Like, we really need to see this new armament system be out for a few months for players to kind of settle in to see what it is, and then whatever inscriptions you have. Ideally, the more inscriptions, the better, but this is kind of the minimum. End game, you can see before it was 28% because the percentage drops dramatically if you're only locking for like certain stats. So for example, if you just take any infantry stat, that's good, but if you won't take anything that's under 2.5, all of a sudden your chances getting it is going to be a lot lower. The top end stat is only probably going to go up like 2% at most, probably even like 1%. I think this update will affect the lower end much more than the higher end, if that makes sense. Okay. So if you get anything from this video, there's a lot of information here. Work on one march at a time. All right. So my personal experience, I shared it with in other videos. I think it was KVK 2 or 3. I think KVK 2. I had it in my head that I wanted to run 6 marches. You know, I was a mid spender. I knew at some point I was going to run 6 marches, and I wanted to be good at canyons, so I wanted to at least have 5 sets of equipment. And I started working on the equipment sets almost all at once. So, you know, for example, I would have all blues on all 5, then I'll start upgrading the purples, and I'll start upgrading the legendary. And it actually sent me back, right? Because while you're working on the equipment, if you didn't get it to that minimum threshold, really it's not that viable on the field. Once you get to that minimum threshold, even though yes, the equipment can be better, but most of the value of that equipment is already there, and the upgrades you get, even though you're still putting in a lot of materials, it's more incremental, whereas before that threshold the upgrades are a lot bigger. So I had a lot of times where I had marches that were either unusable or I try to use them and their trades are really bad, and it actually really limited my performance before KVK 4. And KVK 4, that's when I started kind of catching up for all 6 marches. All of a sudden my performance boosted a lot. Whereas in retrospect, if I worked on one march at a time and I didn't care about canyon or having like 5 marches, I think I would have performed a lot better up to that point, right? Once you catch up, it doesn't matter, but would you actually rather have a route where you have marches that are more useful and trade efficiently, or would you rather do what I did and try to work on a bunch at once, and until you catch up, you don't trade as efficiently, it's not useful, right? Like I would actually work on one march at a time. So let's actually talk about stages of the game. Okay, so in the early stages of the game, and this is talking as a native, right? Because if you've already gone through this, technically you're actually in the mid or end game and you come back. But if you're early game as a native, I count that as pre-KVK, KVK 1, and KVK 2. You actually want to have a lower number of marches. If you looked at the equipment slide I talked about earlier, how like if you have less marches, you could divert a lot more of your resources into just getting one equipment, one set of armament, one march really good. This will allow you to be a lot more competitive with the migrants, because a lot of the people you're fighting, especially from KVK 2 and KVK 2, is they're either going to be people that migrated back or even earlier on, because the power difference is huge between a whale and a non-whale, if you could just focus on one march, at least one of your marches can be competitive with the whales or people that are migrating back. Whereas if you try to go a little bit too wide, it's gonna be really hard. So time, the amount of time you've had compared to other people, or whale in this case, as resources, that's actually the big bottleneck for you, right? If you're a spender, in this case, probably a mid spender where you can max Mina, then you actually probably want to go for Cav first. If not, everything's going to kind of be built around Sun Tzu. So with Mina, you can run like Mina buy bars, Mina Ethelfled, even Mina CC. I probably wouldn't recommend that unless you just got CC to a good place from the gold chest, right? And same thing for infantry. You could run Bjorn as a primary, Sun Tzu secondary. That's actually a very solid epic march, but you could also do Sun Tzu Ethel if Ethel's in a decent place. I think even like 5-1-1-1 Ethel is good enough for KVK1. You probably want that to be like at least like 5-5, probably like 5-5-5-1 or 5-5-1-5. I forgot the third and fourth skill Ethel, but you get the idea. It's, you can actually build off of Sun Tzu for what you want to run. Now, if you are a spender, I talked about this, if you're spending high enough, right now for a while, for at least the next 10 months, Alex will actually be more than viable even in the end game meta, just because he pairs really well with Luce, and we won't have an infantry wheel for a while. So I wouldn't spend gold heads in Alex just because you want that to be able to transition in KVK3. But if you have the ability to buy dailies and max him, that's not a bad idea, because that will actually really help you with the transition. There's no archer commanders really worth investing in or even really using unless you start wasting gold heads in the early game. So I would actually skip archers altogether. So really for the early game, if you're a native, unless you're a huge whale, but even then, I don't really see the point for it. You're either going to run one, at most two marches. Now, mid-game, as I would like to define it, is KVK 3 and 4, because now you have access to end-game commanders, but you're actually still separated from end-game players, right? So KVK 3, there's not crystal tech, there's just end-game commanders, and in KVK 4, even though you get access to crystal tech for the first time, but you're just finding other kingdoms that have reached KVK 4 for the first time. So you're actually separated from some of the monsters out there. For that one, shoot for 3 marches first, so cavalry, infantry, and archer. And in this stage, the commander is actually going to be your bottleneck, because a lot of the commanders you were relying on before all of a sudden become useless, and you almost have to rely on the gold heads that you had saved up to try to catch up, right? If you could buy some dailies, that could help out, but regardless, it's going to be a bottleneck. Okay, so cavalry, the wheel is going to come first. Most of the time, that's going to be your first invest. Right now in February 2024, we're kind of in this weird spot because you probably have about 4 or 5 months, probably about 4 months until the cavalry wheel comes out. So it's not very clear who you should invest in, right? If you invest in Nevsky and Joan and the new cavalry comes out, one of them might get pushed out. So you might actually invest in a commander that in 4 or 5 months is not part of the best meta march. So if you wait to the second wheel, infantry, it's very clear, Luce and then Scipio, and that's going to last for at least like 10, 11 months, probably even like a year or a year or longer, right? So as of this moment right now, for a lot of people that get to KVK 3, I think it's a better play to go for infantry first, because that picture is very clear. And then funny enough, you actually want to go for archers second, just because Herman just came out in January, and you're gonna, the 2 best marches in Archer for a long time, right? At least a year. Whereas we don't know with the Cav. So it's kind of weird, because once the cavalry cycle is closer or it's released, I think it's pretty straightforward. You're gonna invest in cavalry first. It's the first wheel that helps you transition, and then infantry. If you're big infantry simp, maybe you'll skip the Cav wheel. But for a lot of players, like Cav is never going to be the worst, right? Like it's always going to be either the meta or a step away from the meta. Cavalry will be a good investment. Just right now in February 2024, it's kind of a weird stage, but in general, cavalry is probably going to be the first invest. Archer, I made a video about this fairly recently. Their top march is really, really good. A little slow, but really good. but they're not necessarily the best play. So you do want to actually get that archer march, but if you are going to invest in a second archer march, that should be like your sixth march. If you invest in it, it should be probably if you run 5 marches, it's going to be 2 infantry, 2 cavalry, and 1 archer. And even when you do 6 marches, when the cavalry wheel comes out, you actually, honestly, the best pairing, like that 6 march setup might actually be 3 cavalry, 2 infantry, and 1 archer. So that's a little bit further away. We're not sure, but that's just speculation. Okay, now if you're talking about the end game, the bottleneck for how many marches you want to run is usually going to be resources. Okay, because once you get everything to the minimum threshold and beyond, yes, you're still going to work on your equipment, your armaments, and commanders. But once you catch up in commanders, the amount of resources it costs to keep up with commanders and to stay on cycle and stay in the meta actually isn't that hard. But if you want to start going beyond 30 million kills and expanding out, the resources is actually going to be the bottleneck. Okay, so in the end game, for free to play and low spend, I think you should shoot for 3 marches, 1 of each, and just with some activity level and with some, or just playing smart, even free to play players should be able to get there. It might not be within the first 6 months in Season of Conquest, but it's something that you can actually work for and maintain pretty easily, provided your activity and efficiency is there. Right now, I do have a spending tier list and a definition. So for me, low spend is someone that spends, but is spending like more for like efficiency. So you're looking at the daily gem. I forgot what that's called right now, but basically you get 650 gems a day. You're spending for like the Lucerne scrolls, right? $5 or something that essentially you drag out over like almost 2 months. Things like that, maybe dailies, whereas like a mid spend, you're dropping at least 1 gold chest a month or something in that range. And then when you're in KVK, you're actually probably maxing the pop-up bundles that show up as you're leveling your crystal mine and research center. And that's about mid spend. Okay, if you want to get more details on the difference between those, you could watch that video. Again, I'll put the link in the descriptions and also on the end screen. And then if you're whale or kraken, 7 marches. Okay. Now, I would like to invite you to consider checking out my mentoring channel. I just launched it. Right now, there's only 1 video. It was me coaching this player, very impressive player actually. It was about 40 something minutes. In general, it's going to be a lot more like long form mentoring. You're going to see a lot of these ideas that I present actually be talked about in the video. So maybe just like on a screen where we're talking about like concepts, almost like a PowerPoint slide, you might not get it, but when you're hearing me and the player talk about it in the context of like their account and how this applies, maybe you'll click in a lot more. Also on that channel, I'm going to be answering Q&A mailbags. I've been getting a lot of questions, in game, and also like every video I make in the comments, it's just like, hey, should I do this or that? Right? I'll pick the ones that I think will help the most people or clarify the most things. I'll answer. So the email address for that will also be on that channel, right? The channel is actually called Kuang's Gaming Mentoring. Kuang is my real life name, if you haven't figured that out. And also when I do stream on that channel, it'll be more streaming just to interact with people, kind of talk about ideas and not me playing the game. So if you are interested in that, highly recommend you subscribe to that channel so you can see the stuff that comes out. I'm trying to grow that channel as well. Okay, and now if you watch to the end and you haven't done so yet, please like and subscribe to the channel. Really appreciate it. It really makes a difference and helps impact the algorithm and help the channel grow. And again, thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you guys next time.